The shadow over the mahogany desk. The year was 1943, and inside the Abwehr headquarters at Tirpitz 76, the air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the cold realization of impending doom. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, a man whose life was built on the quiet gathering of secrets, found himself staring at a report that felt less like intelligence and more like a death sentence. The mahogany desk beneath his hands, once a symbol of Prussian stability, now felt fragile as he read the intercepted dispatches from Mexico City and Stockholm. The numbers regarding the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant were not merely high. They were physically impossible according to every metric of European manufacturing. To the German mind, which valued craftsmanship and slow, meticulous engineering, the claim that a 4-engine heavy bomber, a machine of 1.5 million parts, could roll off a line every 60 minutes was treated as a clumsy American bluff. Canaris, however, looked out at the Landwehr Canal and saw the ghosts of past failures, realizing that if the mathematics were even partially true, the Third Reich was no longer fighting a war of soldiers, but a war against a tidal wave of steel that they could neither stop nor comprehend. The hubris of the Reich's marshal in the opulent halls of Karen Hall, Hermann Göring, represented the peak of Nazi psychological insulation. When presented with the initial figures of 2,000 aircraft per month from the American industrial heartland, Göring's reaction was one of guttural laughter, a sound that echoed the dangerous overconfidence of the Nazi high command. To Göring and the Luftwaffe leadership, the Americans were a mongrel people, capable only of producing trivial consumer goods like refrigerators and razor blades, items they believed required no soul or warrior spirit. This ideological blindness created a fatal filter. Any intelligence that suggested American democracy could outproduce German autocracy was immediately discarded as Judeo-Bolshevik propaganda. This was the beginning of the Great Disconnect, where the Reich's leadership began living in a mythological reality, while their intelligence officers, like Major Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz, were drowning in cold, hard data that showed the American industrial engine was not just warming up, but was already operating at a velocity that defied Nazi racial and economic theories. The Sorensen Revolution and the Fordist miracle. While Berlin laughed, Charles Sorensen, the cast-iron man of Ford, was rewriting the laws of physics and labor at a site outside Detroit. The Willow Run facility was not just a factory. It was a 3.5 million square foot manifestation of total war. Sorensen's genius lay in deconstructing the B-24 Liberator from a complex aeronautical puzzle into 60,000 discrete, repeatable operations. He understood what the Germans could not: that perfection does not come from the master craftsman's hand, but from the relentless repetition of a specialized machine. By breaking down the assembly into sub-assemblies, rivers of fuselages and wings flowing toward a central mile-long vein, Ford was applying the logic of the Model T to the most complex weapon of the age. This was the miracle that German agents in the U.S. and neutral territories were trying to describe in their frantic cables. They spoke of a building so vast it created its own weather patterns, where Negro women and housewives were riveting wing sections with a mechanical precision that German masterworkers, hampered by traditional methods and a lack of standardized parts, could never match. The intelligent sabotage and the failure of truth. The tragedy of the Abwehr was not a lack of information, but a systemic inability to communicate that information upward without being accused of defeatism. Every report that confirmed the hourly production rate of the B-24 was a direct attack on Hitler's worldview. When Operation Pastorius was launched, sending saboteurs like George John Dash to the American coast, the underlying mission was an act of desperation by Canaris to find a truth that Göring could not ignore. Dash's eventual surrender and his revelations to the FBI underscored the absurdity of the German position. He told his captors that Berlin simply did not believe the production figures. This created a paralyzing feedback loop within German intelligence. The spies gathered the truth, the analysts verified the truth, but the leadership demanded a lie. Consequently, the most accurate intelligence of the war was treated as radioactive. burned in ashtrays at Tirpitz to protect the lives of those who had found it, leaving the German war machine to plan for a conflict against a phantom enemy, while the real one was outproducing them by 300%. The final warning of the mathematics by the time 1943 began to wane. The mathematical inevitability of the war was clear to anyone who could add. The intelligence maps in Canaris's office were now covered in data points from 17 independent sources, all converging on the same terrifying conclusion. It wasn't just Willow Run. It was the entire American industrial complex, from the Kaiser shipyards to the Boeing plants, all synchronized in a way that German central planning could only dream of. The hourly bomber was the symbol of a shift in the global balance of power that rendered traditional military strategy obsolete. If an aircraft lost in combat could be replaced by the time the pilot's lunch break was over, then attrition was no longer a viable strategy for the Axis. Canaris held these figures like a man holding a live grenade, knowing that to present them to Hitler on his upcoming birthday was to essentially sign his own death warrant. The phase of disbelief was ending, and the phase of annihilation was beginning, written in the cold, unyielding language of aluminum shipments and man-hours that the Nazi ideology was fundamentally built to ignore. The architect of the impossible, Charles Sorensen's blueprint to understand the terror that Willow Run struck into the heart of the Abwehr, one must look at the specific engineering philosophy of Charles Sorensen, the man the industry called Cast Iron Charlie. Before Willow Run, aircraft were built like ships, custom-made on stationary jigs where hundreds of workers swarmed over a single fuselage for months. Sorensen realized that to defeat the Axis, the B-24 Liberator had to be treated not as a plane, but as a sequence of mathematical certainties. He spent a sleepless night in a San Diego hotel room sketching the flow production layout that would become the world's largest room. His vision required the fabrication of massive, multi-ton steel dies to stamp out parts with microscopic tolerance, ensuring that any wing produced at 2 a.m. would fit perfectly onto any fuselage produced at 2 p.m. This interchangeability was the holy grail of production that German industry, with its reliance on hand-finishing and skilled artisans, could not replicate. When German spies reported that Ford was spending $200 million on tooling alone, double the investment of the entire German aviation sector, the Nazi leadership dismissed it as an accounting error, unable to fathom an economy that could gamble such wealth on a single factory. The demographic shattering of Nazi theory, while the German master race ideology dictated that only the Aryan male was fit for high-level technical labor, Willow Run was proving that the inferior were the ones winning the war. By mid-1943, the plant was a social laboratory that would have horrified Hitler. 11,000 women, many of whom had never held a tool before 1941, were operating 1,600 specialized machine tools with a precision that exceeded their male predecessors. African-American workers, migrating from the Jim Crow South, were managing complex logistics and operating high-pressure hydraulic presses. This was the democratic utilization of human capital that Spanish and Swedish diplomats reported back to Berlin with stunned disbelief. These reports describe a workforce that was diverse, motivated, and terrifyingly efficient. For the German intelligence analysts at the Abteilung Fremd Luftmacht, Foreign Air Forces branch, these numbers were a psychological blow. They proved that the American mongrel population was not a weakness, but a reservoir of untapped industrial energy that Germany, with its rigid social hierarchies, could never access. Operation Pastorius. The saboteurs despair the insertion of German saboteurs via U-boats onto the shores of Long Island and Florida was the Abwehr's last-ditch effort to physically touch the reality they were seeing on paper. George John Dash and his team were not just sent to blow up bridges. They were Canaris's eyes in the American heartland. However, the moment Dash stepped onto American soil and saw the sheer scale of civilian mobilization, the bustling trains, the neon-lit factories running 3 shifts, the sheer abundance of food and fuel, he experienced a profound psychological collapse. He realized within 48 hours that Germany had already lost. His mission to sabotage the aluminum supply chain felt like trying to stop a forest fire with a water pistol. When he surrendered to the FBI, his testimony was a warning to Berlin. You are fighting a giant that hasn't even fully opened its eyes yet. His betrayal was not born of cowardice, but of the realization that no amount of explosives could destroy a production line that spanned an entire continent. When this reached Canaris, he understood that even the most elite German soldiers were being mentally defeated by the mere sight of American capacity. The geometry of the mile-long line, the sheer physical geography of the Willow Run plant, was designed to break the spirit of any opposing force. The L-shaped building, designed by Albert Kahn, was so vast that it required internal police forces on bicycles just to move messages between departments. The assembly line was a masterpiece of kinetic geometry. It began with raw aluminum ingots at one end and ended with a fueled, flight-ready B-24 Liberator at the other. German analysts who studied the smuggled aerial photographs noticed a detail that chilled them: the turn. Because the factory was built on the edge of a county line to avoid certain taxes, the assembly line had to make a 90-degree turn. Sorensen designed a massive turntable system that could rotate an 18-ton bomber without stopping the flow of production. This level of mechanical audacity was beyond anything in the Ruhr Valley. To the German observers, this wasn't just a factory. It was a continental machine, a singular organism that consumed 2.5 million kilowatts of electricity, enough to power a medium-sized European city, just to keep the lights on and the rivets flying. The intelligence filter and the death of strategic truth by late 1943, the collision was no longer a theory. It was a physical weight pressing down on the German borders. Yet, the information hierarchy in Berlin had become a filter of hubris. Even as Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister, began to see the American data through his own clandestine channels, he found himself trapped. To tell Hitler that a single factory in Michigan was outproducing the combined efforts of Heinkel, Messerschmitt, and Junkers was to be labeled a defeatist, a crime punishable by death. This led to the most catastrophic intelligence failure in modern history. The German High Command began making strategic decisions based on comfortable lies rather than mathematical truths. They planned for an air defense against 500 bombers when 2,000 were already in the air. They allocated resources to wonder weapons, the V-1 and V-2, while ignoring the fact that the Americans were producing standard weapons at a rate that made technological superiority irrelevant. The collision of the Fordist assembly line and the Nazi ideological wall was now complete, and the resulting impact was about to flatten the Third Reich. The arrival of the Big Week. Operation Argument. By February 1944, the mathematical predictions sitting on Admiral Canaris's desk transformed into a physical canopy of silver wings over the Reich. The Americans launched Operation Argument, popularly known as Big Week, a strategic masterstroke designed to bait the Luftwaffe into a battle of total attrition. For 6 consecutive days, the American 8th and 15th Air Forces dispatched over 1,000 heavy bombers per day, escorted by the long-range P-51 Mustangs. This was the moment the Willow Run effect hit the German front lines. While German pilots were elite and their planes technologically sophisticated, they were facing a swarm that defied logic. For every B-24 shot down, 2 more were already clearing the runway in Michigan. German ace Adolf Galland noted with horror that the sky seemed to be made of American aluminum. The deluge was not just about the bombs being dropped. It was about the crushing realization that the Americans were fighting with an industrial reserve that Germany could never deplete. The arrival of the Big Week. Operation Argument. By February 1944, the mathematical predictions sitting on Admiral Canaris's desk transformed into a physical canopy of silver wings over the Reich. The Americans launched Operation Argument, popularly known as Big Week, a strategic masterstroke designed to bait the Luftwaffe into a battle of total attrition. For 6 consecutive days, the American 8th and 15th Air Forces dispatched over 1,000 heavy bombers per day, escorted by the long-range P-51 Mustangs. This was the moment the Willow Run effect hit the German front lines. The German pilots were no longer fighting a military. They were fighting a factory. The psychological impact of seeing 800 bombers in a single, disciplined formation, each one representing millions of man-hours and thousands of rivets, broke the morale of the German high command. The mathematical inevitability that Canaris had whispered about in 1943 had become a sky-high reality that no amount of Nazi propaganda could hide. The economics of total attrition. Dollars versus marks as the bombs fell, the economic disparity between the two nations became a gaping chasm. Willow Run had not only master production speed, but also the economy of scale. By 1944, the cost of a B-24 Liberator had plummeted from $238,000 to $137,000 per unit. Meanwhile, German production costs were skyrocketing due to the decentralization of factories to avoid bombing and the scarcity of rare materials like chromium and tungsten. The Americans were essentially printing bombers while Germany was scavenging for scrap metal. Dr. Albert Speer, finally gaining control over the armaments ministry, attempted to Fordize German production, but he lacked the raw materials and the protected geography of the United States. Every time Speer managed to increase production, a single raid by Willow Run-built bombers would set the German industry back by months. It was a race between a sprinter, Germany, and a marathon runner with a motorized vehicle, the U.S. The outcome was no longer in doubt. It was merely a question of how much of Germany would remain when the math finally finished its work. The death of the intelligence officers for the men who had tried to warn the Reich, the arrival of the American bombers, was a bittersweet vindication that carried a death warrant. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris and his deputy, Hans Oster, were now viewed as the architects of defeatism. The Gestapo and the SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, viewed the accurate reporting of American industrial capacity as a form of psychological sabotage. In the paranoid atmosphere of 1944, truth was treason. Those who had counted the cars in the Willow Run parking lot through Swedish telescopes or analyzed the aluminum shipments from Pennsylvania were systematically purged. The execution of Canaris at Flossenburg concentration camp was the final silencing of the rational wing of German intelligence. He was hung with piano wire, a brutal end for a man who realized that a nation's greatest intelligence failure isn't failing to see the enemy, but failing to believe the enemy's strength. With the thinkers gone, only the fanatics remained to preside over the ruins. The demographic verdict, Rosie the Riveter wins the final blow to the Nazi worldview, was delivered not by a general, but by the inferior workforce of the American Midwest. The 11,000 women and 3,800 African Americans at Willow Run were outproducing the entirety of the German master race labor force. This demographic breakdown was the ultimate proof that democracy's greatest strength was its ability to mobilize its entire population. While German women were largely kept at home to fulfill the Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church ideal, American women like Roswell Monroe were mastering hydraulic presses and rivet guns. This was the total war that Goebbels had called for in his speeches, but only the Americans had actually achieved it. The B-24 Liberator was more than a weapon. It was a physical manifestation of a social system that valued merit and output over blood and soil. By April 1944, when the plant hit its peak of one bomber every 63 minutes, the war of ideologies was over. The American assembly line had proven that freedom was the most efficient fuel for a war machine. The bunker and the final denial by April 1945, the mathematical inevitability that had once been a folder on a desk in Berlin was now a rain of fire over the Führer bunker. In his final days, Adolf Hitler remained surrounded by maps of non-existent divisions, still refusing to acknowledge that the steel crushing his city was forged by the very mongrel democracy he had mocked. A final German intelligence report, dated April 20th, Hitler's 54th and final birthday, was discovered in the ruins. It was a haunting post-mortem, a confirmation that every figure regarding Willow Run was true and that the Reich had died not from a lack of intelligence, but from a lack of wisdom. The report remained undelivered. The man it was intended for was busy blaming the German people for their own destruction. The B-24s, many of which had been built by women and minorities in Michigan just months prior, were now circling above, serving as the final, thunderous argument in a debate that the Nazi leadership had lost years earlier. The postmortem of a worldview. Nuremberg testimonies. The Nuremberg trials provided a cold, analytical look into how a modern state could ignore its own eyes. Walter Schellenberg and Albert Speer, during their interrogations, painted a picture of a systemic filter. Speer admitted that by early 1943, he knew the war was lost on an industrial level. He confessed that to accept the Willow Run figures, to believe that Ford could produce a bomber every hour, was to accept that the National Socialist worldview was fundamentally flawed. It meant acknowledging that democracy was not weak, that racial diversity was an engine of strength, and that a free people could out-organize a slave state. The intelligence failure was redefined by historians not as a failure of spies, but as a failure of acceptance. The German leadership had built a reality where truth was a commodity that had to fit an ideological mold, and when it didn't, they simply discarded it until the reality physically broke down their doors. The convergence of two worlds, Monroe and Rudel, 1985. Perhaps the most profound closure to this saga occurred decades later, in 1985, at the dedication of the Yankee Air Museum. Roswell Monroe, the real-life Rosie the Riveter, who had driven thousands of rivets into Willow Run B-24s, stood face-to-face with Hans Rudel, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated pilots. When Rudel asked with genuine bewilderment how they had built so many planes so fast, Monroe's answer was disarmingly simple. "Honey, we just went to work every day and did our job." This encounter symbolized the ultimate triumph of the Willow Run miracle. It wasn't just about the 8,685 bombers built at that single plant. It was about the millions of ordinary people who utilized their freedom to achieve an extraordinary output. Rudel's response, that they had been told lies about American weakness, served as a final apology from a generation that had been blinded by ideology. The statistical ghost, Willow Run's lasting impact, the final accounting of American production from 1940 to 1945, remains one of the most staggering data sets in human history. The United States produced over 300,000 aircraft, outproducing Germany by a factor of 3.2, while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war and supplying the Soviet Union and Great Britain. Willow Run alone consumed more electricity than entire German cities and cost more than the Reich's entire aircraft industry investment for the decade. These were not just simple goods, as Hitler had claimed. They were the most complex machines of the era, produced with a surgical precision that paved the way for the post-war aerospace industry. The factory itself became the template for the modern world, proving that total mobilization was possible within a democratic framework. It proved that in the age of industrial warfare, the assembly line was as powerful as any artillery battery, and the woman with a rivet gun was as decisive as the soldier with a rifle. The warning for the 21st century, reality versus ideology, the story of Willow Run and the German intelligence failure, carries a profound warning for the modern era. Truth ignored becomes tragedy. In an age of algorithmic echo chambers and ideological polarization, the lessons of Tirpitz-Ziffer 76 are more relevant than ever. When a system punishes unwelcome truths and rewards comfortable lies, it sets itself on a path toward catastrophic miscalculation. Mathematics does not yield to mythology. The physical capacity of a factory or the data of a pandemic does not care about the political beliefs of a leader. The Willow Run anomaly serves as a permanent reminder that the ultimate strength of a nation lies in its ability to face reality, however uncomfortable it may be. The Fourth Reich died because it chose to believe its own propaganda over the cold, hard numbers of an American assembly line, a mistake that cost millions of lives and reshaped the world forever. The metallurgy of victory. Aluminum as a strategic weapon, the German intelligence failure was rooted not just in counting planes, but in failing to understand the supply chain of a superpower. While the Abwehr was tracking finished airframes, they were blind to the unprecedented surge in American aluminum production, which had grown by 600% in a matter of months. In 1943, the Ford Willow Run plant was consuming 16 million pounds of aluminum every 30 days, a figure that exceeded the entire monthly output of the German Reich. Admiral Canaris had obtained manifests from the Pennsylvania Railroad showing these shipments. Yet when these documents reached Berlin, they were treated as mathematical fictions. The Nazi leadership could not conceive of an industrial base that could divert such massive quantities of precious metal to a single facility without collapsing the rest of its economy. This was the invisible front, where American miners, refiners, and transport workers were engaging in a form of logistical warfare that the German High Command, focused on the heroism of the front line, considered secondary. To the German mind, victory was won by the pilot. To the American mind, victory was pre-calculated by the supply officer. The standardization crisis, artisans versus automation, a primary reason for the German disbelief was the deep-seated cultural pride in German craftsmanship. By utilizing 1,600 specialized machine tools designed for single operations, Ford achieved a level of tolerances that handcrafting could never match. The German intelligence officers who had lived in the U.S., like Ritter, tried to explain that this automation of precision meant the Americans were building higher quality machines at 1,000 times the speed. This was the technological collision that the Nazi worldview, which romanticized the individual artisan, was psychologically incapable of accepting. The social revolution on the assembly line beyond the steel and the rivets. Willow Run was the site of a social disruption that the Abwehr correctly identified, but the Nazi leadership ideologically rejected. The reports of 42,000 workers, including 11,000 women and thousands of African Americans, working in harmony was viewed in Berlin as a sign of democratic chaos. Nazi racial theory taught that such a mongrelized workforce would be inefficient, prone to infighting, and incapable of high-precision labor. They expected the American industrial effort to collapse under the weight of its own diversity. Instead, the Willow Run mirage turned out to be an engine of social cohesion. The Rosie the Riveter phenomenon was not just a propaganda tool. It was the entry of an entire demographic into the industrial workforce, doubling the nation's labor capacity overnight. When German spies reported that housewives were managing the hydraulic installation of B-24 tail sections, the information was filtered out because it contradicted the core Nazi tenet of Kinder, Kusch, Kirche. This ideological blind spot meant Germany was fighting with only half its potential human capital, while the Americans were utilizing every hand available. The weather inside the machine. The architecture of scale, the physical environment of Willow Run was so massive it challenged the very laws of nature, a fact that became a legend among German intelligence circles. The factory was so voluminous that on humid Michigan mornings, condensation would form near the ceiling, creating localized rain inside the building. When this detail appeared in an intelligence report, Göring famously used it as proof that the Americans were lying, reasoning that no building could be so large it had its own climate. Yet, this scale was the secret to the B-24 success. The 3.5 million square feet of floor space allowed for a straight-line production flow that was nearly a mile long. This meant that the complexity of a bomber was broken down into a series of simple, linear steps. The German analysts who studied the aerial photographs of the parking lots, counting 12,000 cars belonging to workers, made a calculation. If each car represented 1.5 workers across 3 shifts, the manpower was undeniable. But in Berlin, these cars were dismissed as stage props for the cameras. The Nazi leadership chose to believe the Americans had built a fake city rather than accept they had built a real factory. The fatal delay, the strategic cost of disbelief, the ultimate consequence of the failure to believe the Willow Run intelligence was the misallocation of the Reich's remaining resources. Because Hitler and Göring did not believe the Americans could produce 1,400 heavy bombers a month, they delayed the transition of the German economy to a total war footing until it was far too late. They continued to produce offensive bombers for retaliation strikes against London long after they should have switched entirely to defensive fighter production. Had they accepted the Abwehr's data in early 1943, Germany might have flooded the skies with interceptors a year earlier, potentially making the Allied daylight bombing campaign too costly to continue. Instead, by the time the Big Week arrived in 1944, the American production machine was so far ahead that no amount of German effort could close the gap. The intelligence was there, the warnings were clear, and the math was simple. But the Reich chose to die in a state of ideological purity rather than survive through the acceptance of an uncomfortable reality.